Usually, the way crimes unfold is that someone tragically loses their life, but we initially don't know who the perpetrator is. It takes police weeks, days, months, even years to find the wrongdoer. But the case we're about to discuss today is everything and nothing like you've ever heard of. A crime took place on August 1st, 2019 in Mansfield, England. And what was so frightening about it was the fact that the perpetrator, within a minute of ending someone's life, confessed to it. What was even more alarming was that the victim's best friend saw the perpetrator flee. The terrible and mind-numbing case of 18-year-old Liam Gray might sound straightforward and cut and dry, but it's so much more chilling, haunting, and callous than you could ever believe. Welcome to True Crime Stories. If you're sick of the boring and overdramatic AI-narrated channels, then you've come to the right place. We do things a bit different here at True Crime Stories, more akin to a traditional true crime documentary of years gone by. So if you're interested in more old-fashioned style true crime, hit that subscribe button. It's totally free and will keep you up to date with all of my future cases. Liam Peters, better known as Liam Gray, was born in 2001 to parents Joanne and Tony Peters. Liam had two sisters, an older one named Paige and a younger one named Madison, and a younger brother named Freddie. Liam's family was tight-knit, and his mom Joanne defined Liam as a happy-go-lucky child. Liam was the type of person that loved to goof around, and he had a personality that would always put a smile on everyone's face. One of Liam's traits was making everyone laugh. He would randomly belt out in song by the Backstreet Boys, and his family said that he had a heart of gold. Liam was also very easygoing and tried his best to include everyone, and his contagious and bright personality made him extremely likable. When Liam was in his teens, he met a girl named Sean through a mutual friend, and the two hit it off like a house on fire. Liam and Sean, even though they were very young, just clicked, and there was never a dull or awkward pause in their dates. They were super compatible with each other, and it's safe to say they were truly in love. Their 3-year-long relationship took a very serious turn when Liam found out he was going to be a father. Even though a lot of people in the same age group would run for the hills at this news, Liam was ecstatic. Liam, with his gentle, kind, and caring personality, was born to be a father, and everyone in his family and friend circle knew Liam was going to handle everything just fine. In fact, when Sean broke the news to Liam, he got very emotional and elated. It was safe to say that Liam was looking forward to this new, exciting, and different chapter of his life. But Liam, as amazing as his personal life was going, was having a hard time in school, so he decided to move in with his grandfather, John, who was affectionately called Pops, in his home on Gladstone Street in Mansfield. This was the best decision Liam could have made for himself, and he was happier than ever. Sadly, though, this very house would turn into a place plagued with hurt and agony for the Gray family. Liam's best friend was Reese, and the two were his closest siblings. Liam and Reese essentially grew up together and also went to the same school since they literally lived right across the street from each other. The friends were so close that even Reese called John Pops. As time went on, Liam and Reese's friendship only got stronger, and Reese defined Liam as his pillar of support. Reese also adored Pops a lot, and even said that without Liam and Pops, he'd be lost in life. While living with Pops, Reese introduced Liam to one of his friends, and his name was Jonathan Treadgold. But Jonathan's life was a complete 180 from what Liam had experienced. Jonathan, originally from Kent Close, Worksop, was in and out of foster homes for a very long time. His family was very toxic, and Jonathan's parents were not only violent, but also raging drug abusers. At the age of 14, Jonathan also had various run-ins with the law, and he was charged with criminal damage and threatening behavior. Jonathan also had a history of abusing alcohol and becoming very rageful and violent, leading him to assault someone on one occasion. If that wasn't scary enough, Jonathan was also convicted 6 weeks before the events of today's case for violently assaulting his girlfriend, which is just terrifying to think that a young, barely 18-year-old man could be capable of such violent tendencies. But anyway, Jonathan had a very different life as compared to Liam and Reese. Liam, being the caring and non-judgmental person that he was, befriended Jonathan, seemingly out of sheer sympathy. Liam wanted to look out for Jonathan and help him turn his life around because Jonathan was mostly a loner, and Liam didn't want to leave him like this. But Liam's mom, Joanne, didn't share the similar thoughts as Liam. According to Joanne, Jonathan, even though he was very young, had a dangerous air about him. Call it motherly instinct, but Joanne didn't like Liam hanging out with Jonathan. Liam's sisters had also heard about Jonathan's bad deeds, but like Liam, they wanted to give him a chance. They hoped that good company would change him. But some things just never change, and Joanne's gut feeling was right. Jonathan was a lost cause, and even with the support that Liam had to offer, in August of 2019, everything came crashing down in the worst way that would forever ruin the Gray family. As soon as Liam found out that he was going to be a father, he underwent a miraculous change. He wanted to be the best father for his child, so Liam decided to take responsibility. He wanted to focus on building a better future for his growing family. According to Reese, Liam was over the moon after hearing this news, and he wanted to do everything in his power to provide for his child. Fast forward to July 18th of 2019. Liam and Sean welcomed a healthy baby girl, whom they named Isla Page. Liam, as soon as he was holding his baby in his arms, knew what happiness felt like. He was now a young father, and although there were going to be a lot of challenges, the couple was determined to face them together and come out on the other side. In light of his baby's birth, Liam made the decision to move from Mansfield to Birmingham with his girlfriend to start their lives on a clean slate. This news, as exciting as it was for Liam's family, also saddened them. Liam had lived close to his family all this time, and they were going to miss him now that he was moving about 65 miles away. Knowing that he would be moving away within days, Liam decided to spend the remainder of his time with his two closest friends, Reese and Jonathan. August 1st of 2019 was a hot summer day in Mansfield, and the trio had made plans to have loads of fun at Liam's grandfather's house before he left for Birmingham. The friends spent time in the garden, singing and having fun, and making videos on Snapchat. Liam, Reese, and Jonathan then went to a local store to buy alcohol. They'd planned to take it back to Pop's house and spend the evening there. Liam even suggested that 17-year-old Jonathan change out of his casual clothes into something nicer, and he lent him a pair of his jeans to make him look more presentable, as the trio had plans to kill time at a local pub. En route to the pub, Reese received a text on his phone, and it was from Jonathan's sister's boyfriend. Now, the contents of this message are unclear, but judging by the reaction of Liam and his group, it might have been something heated or maybe inappropriate. Liam, upon viewing the text, verbally slammed the boyfriend and stood up for Jonathan's sister. Now, you might think that Jonathan would take pride in this action, seeing as one of his best friends is standing by his and his sister's side. But Jonathan's reaction was the complete opposite of what you would expect. Jonathan violently lashed out at Liam, and the two got into a verbal altercation that soon escalated to the point where Liam, having had enough of Jonathan's bizarre behavior, suggested that Jonathan needed to leave if he was going to keep acting like that. Jonathan was irate and barely kept his rage in check before storming from the park back to Liam's home on Gladstone Street. After calming down, Liam felt bad about what he had said to Jonathan and suggested that he and Reese go back to the house and make amends. It was Liam's last day in Mansfield, and he didn't want to leave Jonathan, his best friend, in a bad mood, which really goes to show how Liam was as a person. Even though Jonathan's reaction was uncalled for and senseless to say the least, Liam wanted to patch things up and leave on a good note. After Liam and Reese made it to Pop's house, who was in the living room, Liam went inside to speak with Jonathan alone, while Reese waited out in the garden. Reese was expecting the two young men to come out of the house at any moment, having made amends and brought things back to good terms. But nothing could have prepared Reese for what he witnessed just moments later. Not even a minute had passed since Liam disappeared inside the house, and Reese saw a clearly distressed Jonathan running out of the front door. Reese barely even registered the words that came out of Jonathan's mouth, which were, "I killed him." Jonathan took off in a run, and Reese, after recovering from the initial shock of the whole interaction, rushed into the house, and what he saw is forever burned into his mind. Reese made his way to the dining room, and he saw Liam holding a tea towel to his chest, which was soaked in blood. Near Liam's body was a huge kitchen knife. Liam was pale and soon collapsed to the ground. With Liam was his grandfather, John, trying to stop the bleeding and keeping pressure on the wound while asking Reese to call the emergency services as soon as possible. Reese couldn't believe the horrific scene in front of him. On autopilot, he dialed emergency services, and an ambulance as well as the police were quickly dispatched to the scene. Paramedics arrived almost immediately and tried to save Liam's life. He was still breathing, but he had a weak pulse and had lost a lot of blood. At one point, paramedics had to manually keep Liam's heart pumping. As paramedics were fighting tooth and nail to save Liam, some officers were dispatched to catch Jonathan, and the rest, along with Reese, went to Liam's mom, Joanne's home, to break the terrifying news of her son getting attacked. Joanne and Liam's sisters were shocked to the core upon hearing this news. Liam was just having fun with his friends before leaving for Birmingham with his family, and now the young father had been attacked out of nowhere and was fighting for his life. Meanwhile, the police who were after Jonathan got a call from someone. It was the owner of a local sandwich shop, and according to him, a young man had climbed over his shop wall and then confided in him about being involved in a violent situation and that he had attacked a person in self-defense. The boy even went on to show the shop owner scratch marks on his stomach by lifting his shirt. This boy was obviously Jonathan. Back to Gladstone Street, at around 3:15 p.m., Joanne made it to the house as Liam was being wheeled into an ambulance. Joanne was shaken, in tears, and just wanted to hold her son's hand. But she obviously couldn't, because paramedics were swarming around young Liam's body, trying to keep his heart beating and his breathing stable. Joanne tearfully addressed Liam by telling him that she loved him, hoping that her unconscious son heard her. It's so heartbreaking to see Joanne witnessing the brutal state that her son was in. The pain reverberating through Joanne and the rest of the Gray family, it's beyond imagination. Liam was rushed to Queen's Medical Center in Nottingham, and he needed emergency open heart surgery. But tragically, after 1.5 hours of the doctors and staff trying to save Liam, he lost his life. Liam was only 18 years old and was on the cusp of starting a new chapter of his life with the two people he loved the most, his girlfriend Sean and their daughter Isla, who was just brought into the world 13 days before the tragic and sudden attack on Liam. Joanne, upon hearing the news of her son's passing, felt her heart fracture, and she knew her life would never be the same again. Paige broke down and had a severe panic attack just outside the hospital, whereas Madison, who was at home, received a dreadful call and remembered collapsing to the floor in tears. One fatal wound, inflicted by none other than Liam's own friend, had driven the Gray family into an endless pit of sadness, disbelief, and utmost tragedy. Meanwhile, Jonathan was still on the run. The police were close by when they received another call, which disclosed Jonathan's current location. He was at a family friend's house where he'd confessed to attacking Liam. The police swarmed the area, and finally at 3:33 p.m., Jonathan was arrested by the police. Initially, the police had arrested Jonathan on the charge of causing grievous bodily harm, since no one knew quite yet that Liam had passed away from his surgery. But after Liam's passing, his charge was upgraded to murder. What was so appalling was that Jonathan stuck to the story of acting in self-defense. According to Jonathan, Liam was the one who attacked him first, and in fear for his life, Jonathan snatched the knife from Liam's hand and attacked him before running off. Interestingly, while being held in a jail cell, Jonathan was tested for his blood alcohol levels. Now, keep in mind that several hours had passed since he had anything to drink and had been arrested, but the results showed that his alcohol level was still 3 times the legal driving limit. This man was more than just drunk, he wasn't even on this planet anymore. But after Liam's tragic passing, the doctors performed an autopsy, and what they found was absolutely baffling. See, if Jonathan's version of events was true, Liam would have suffered from a great deal of defensive wounds, but there was only one deep stab wound to his chest, and no defensive wounds on his arms or the rest of his body. The fatal wound to Liam's chest also had a lot to say about how Liam was attacked. In most self-defense attacks, there's no intention to kill. The victim merely tries to fight off the attacker and lightly subdue them. So if what Jonathan was saying was true, the wound on Liam's chest should have been a slash rather than a jab, but the autopsy revealed the latter. Liam's wound was intentional and deep, and moreover, the police also went through a load of CCTV footage, and through it they found heaps of evidence that were contradictory to Jonathan's self-defense rules. See, according to Jonathan, Liam was an intimidating and violent person, and he'd apparently attacked Jonathan before. Jonathan went on to paint Liam as a violent young man by saying that he was a bully and that he picked on Jonathan for years, which doesn't even make sense. But when police viewed the CCTV footage of the trio buying alcohol at the supermarket, nothing was out of the ordinary. If you don't count the fact that Jonathan was shirtless in a public place, that is. Liam's gait and body language were not intimidating or scary by any means. It looked like three friends buzzing around the store, buying alcohol. Anyway, Jonathan also claimed that after the argument with Liam, he ran to Pop's house to get away from the violent and angry Liam. But this claim was shut down pretty quickly when police viewed surveillance footage and found Jonathan not running, but slowly walking towards the house. His stride did not look like someone who was afraid of Liam. Also, Reese was there the entire time, and he corroborated that Liam hadn't done anything violent to provoke fear in Jonathan. The only time Jonathan was seen running was after he had attacked Liam, and it clearly looked like he was trying to make a run for it. Nottinghamshire Police Superintendent Kevin Broadhead looked into Jonathan's record of social services, and in it, he found some disturbing things. See, Jonathan had a tendency to harm himself, and the scars on his stomach, the ones he claimed were the result of Liam attacking him, were actually not current, and they were confirmed to have been self-inflicted quite some time ago. So Jonathan was basically trying to throw Liam under the bus by painting him as a bully and a violent man, when in reality, the real danger was actually Jonathan himself. Even though it was initially believed that Jonathan acted in a violent drunken haze, he was coherent enough to come up with an unbelievable self-defense story to try to save his skin. Well, that obviously didn't work for too long. Jonathan was in custody, but what the police and really everyone wanted to know was, why? Why did Jonathan act so violently towards someone who regarded him as a close friend? It couldn't have just been some petty fight about text messages, right? Well, Superintendent Broadhead speculated that Jonathan was actually extremely jealous of Liam. Liam had his life together. He had a healthy and happy relationship, he had a loving family of his own, and he went on to build his own tribe as well, whereas Jonathan's life was what could be defined as a mess. He had no family, no goals, no plans to better his life, and he was just racking up criminal charges after criminal charges. This comparison caused Jonathan to basically resent his best friend. Although it wasn't like Liam was trying to be bashful about his life and achievements, he was genuinely trying to help Jonathan as much as he could. But sadly, Jonathan didn't see it that way, and internally, he was rotting away with jealousy and bitterness for Liam. Now, keep in mind that this is all speculation, since Jonathan has not come out with any confession and still maintains that he acted in self-defense. Either way, Jonathan's trial was held on November 1st, and infuriatingly, he was tried as a child since he was technically under 18 when he committed the crime. This was quite upsetting for Joanne and the Gray family, as well as the general public, because everyone wanted to see Jonathan get punished for what he did to Liam. To add to everyone's anger and devastation, Jonathan pleaded not guilty to the charges, and this led to another autopsy being performed on Liam's body at the defense's request. For Joanne, it was very painful to see her son's peace disturbed over and over again. She just wanted Jonathan to face the consequences and move on from this nightmare. Because of his age, Jonathan's identity was initially hidden, but the court did decide to bring out the defendant and killer in public, no matter what his age was, because what Jonathan made the Gray family go through by tragically ending Liam's life was inhumane in every sense. But finally, on February 7th of 2020, almost 6 months after the tragic passing of Liam, the jury reached a verdict. As the courtroom waited with bated breath, the jury read out that Jonathan was found guilty, and 3 days later, on February 10th, he was sentenced to life in prison with a minimum of 16 years. Jonathan, throughout the trial, was emotionless, and the only thing he ever said after the verdict was given was, "sound." Even after the Gray family and the rest of the public broke out in cheers at the sentence, they couldn't help but feel that it wasn't nearly enough because of how violent and out of the blue the crime was. Following Liam's untimely passing on Sunday, August 18th of 2019, a fundraising event was held to raise money for Liam's funeral, his infant daughter, and a donation for a knife crime charity. A GoFundMe page was set up to raise £5,000 to help the Gray family say goodbye to Liam. And at the funeral, Liam's casket was draped in the colors of the Liverpool Football Club, his favorite club, and it was carried in a horse-drawn carriage. What was so heartbreaking was that Liam's grandfather, John, who witnessed the attack on his beloved grandson, paid tribute to Liam, laced with the remorse and guilt for not being able to successfully save him. John went on to say, quote, "I miss you terribly. I tried so much to help you. My best wasn't enough, and I'm so sorry." It's so devastating to see John breaking down, reliving his attempt to save Liam's life on that fateful day of August 1st. He did try his best to save Liam, but I don't think any words will ever be able to convince Pops that it isn't his fault. Liam's girlfriend, Sean, well, she was a mess. Sean has made a memory box for Isla containing pictures, mementos, and scrapbooks of Liam, and she vows that Liam won't be forgotten, and Isla will remember him forever, even though his time with her was incredibly short. Jonathan, someone who Liam knew and wanted to so desperately help, robbed the once happy family of every joyous moment that Liam could ever share with them. We can only hope that Liam's family, including his daughter, can try to move on from this tragedy and pave their way towards healing. A petty argument, resentment, or whatever the case may be, Liam didn't deserve to have his life snuffed out so brutally, and especially not at the hands of someone he regarded as a friend. I can't help but feel a small amount of remorse for Jonathan as well, because his life was hard through and through, but that didn't mean he had to make similar bad decisions like his parents and his peers did. He had his own thoughts, his own desires, and his own ability to make good choices, but he chose not to. That, in itself, is devastating. Friends are supposed to be the people that hype you up in your successes. It's said that a bond built on trust and respect is the strongest, but whatever Jonathan had with Liam was the farthest thing from friendship, because people blessed with real and solid friendships never have to go through what young Liam did. Liam tried so hard to help make Jonathan's life better, but in return, Jonathan ended Liam's. Police officers take an oath to protect the community. We trust them to safeguard lives and not violate people's rights during their service. But it can be easy to forget that cops are people too. They can make mistakes and they can make bad decisions. This is particularly clear when we look at the case of 20-year-old aspiring marine biologist Elly Warren, whose lifeless body was found near a bar on Tofo Beach in Mozambique on November 9, 2016. After her body was found, the local police dragged the case through the depths of disinterest and back. And in fact, the very police that locals relied on for protection proved to be uncaring and heartless. These so-called detectives classified Elly's case as accidental, even though there was a sickening amount of evidence to prove otherwise. They made Elly's grieving father travel across the globe for answers and inflicted the Warren family with insurmountable grief. And all they wanted to do was just find justice for their daughter. The case of Elly Warren is infuriating on so many levels, not only because she lost her life at the hands of a violent criminal, but because the Mozambique police couldn't care less. Welcome to True Crime Stories. If you're new here, I post new true crime cases every single week with none of those crappy AI narrations, just you, me, and a case to solve. So if you want to see some good old-fashioned true crime documentaries, hit that subscribe button. It's totally free and it'll keep you up to date with all of my future videos. Elly Warren was born in 1996 in Melbourne, Australia. Elly's family consists of her parents, Nicole and Paul, and a younger sister, Christy. Growing up, Elly was a vibrant and fun-loving girl, and she loved her family to bits, but her home life wasn't exactly perfect. When Elly was still young, her parents got divorced, but this sad and life-altering moment didn't stop Elly from being the loving and lively person that she was. Even though her parents were no longer together, Elly shared a close bond with both of them, but she was particularly close with her dad. Paul and Elly were best friends. They would spend a lot of time together and visit Elly's favorite place on Earth at the time, and that was the beach. Paul adored his daughter and defined her as being a young lady who craved adventure and loved life. To Paul, Elly was his treasure, and the two were essentially inseparable. Elly's mom, Nicole, described Elly as a girl who was full of life. She loved adventure and had a hunger for exploring, and was known to be overwhelmingly friendly. Growing up, Elly attended Parkdale Secondary College, and after high school, she had plans to enroll in James Cook University in North Queensland to pursue a career in marine biology. Elly loved the outdoors, but if there was one thing she loved more, it was exploring different countries and their cultures, specifically Africa. So Elly got to work. In 2016, she juggled 3 different jobs in hopes of affording a marine biology program in Tofo, Mozambique. See, before Elly went away for college, she wanted to experience working with marine biologists and scientists to satisfy her inner wanderlust. It was the perfect opportunity, really. Elly would spend time with the people there that she looked up to and explore the vast marine life in different countries of the world. So in October of 2016, Elly accompanied the underwater diving group called Underwater Africa for 6 weeks in Tofo Beach, located in Mozambique, South Africa. Elly packed her bags, bid her family farewell, and was more than ready and beyond excited to start this new life-changing adventure. Once she reached Mozambique, Elly stayed in a bungalow that was part of Casa Berry, a popular diving resort at Tofo Beach. For 6 weeks, Elly was part of a dream volunteer group. They would take a boat out to the reefs of this beautiful place, and Elly had the time of her life underwater. She was in awe of the natural beauty, and this experience really cemented her goals for the future, and that was to help save the world, preserve marine life, and become someone who could make a difference. Elly, during her 6-week trip to Mozambique, was also in contact with her family, and her parents remembered the excitement in her voice whenever they asked her how she was doing there. Elly was elated that she got to experience something like this, and it was something that she would remember forever. 6 weeks passed in a blur, with all of the activities and new underwater discoveries and sights that Elly had experienced. And in early November of 2016, it was finally time for Elly to go back home and start the new chapter of her life that was college. But sadly, Elly would never board the plane back to Australia, and the very place that she loved the most turned into a dreadful pit of terror, not only for Elly, but for her family too. November 8th, 2016 was supposed to be Elly's last day in Mozambique. Now, there are mixed reports as to what happened next. Some reports say that Elly checked into camp and met up with her friends, and it was suggested that Elly also left some of her belongings there. But one report by the manager of the hostel where Elly was living stated that she never checked in that day. Regardless, later that night, Elly and her group went out to celebrate the end of their 6-week program, and they spent a majority of the evening at a local bar called Victor's Bar near the beach. According to Elly's friends, she did have a couple of drinks, but she was coherent, alert, and didn't seem drunk at all. The next day, Elly was supposed to catch a flight back to Australia to see her parents, and she was very excited to see her family again. Elly's parents missed her too, as 6 weeks was the longest they'd ever been apart. But Elly never boarded the plane. In fact, after Tuesday, Elly failed to reach out to her family, which immediately panicked Nicole and Paul. They tried calling Elly and everyone she knew, but they didn't hear anything promising. After some time, though, Elly's parents got a call, but it wasn't from Elly. It was Elly's younger sister, Christy, and she had devastating news for them. Christy was hysterical on the phone and was repeatedly heard screaming, "Elly was murdered." Elly's parents were struck with unimaginable horror. Learning that their daughter's life had been taken was horrible enough, but the awful act being done on another continent was heart-dropping. Elly's parents were crushed with grief, and they had a mountain of questions. Who did this to Elly? Why would anyone want to hurt Elly? What happened to her? Paul and Nicole's lives were turned upside down. Even so, Paul and Nicole were hopeful that the Mozambique authorities would get to the bottom of their daughter's tragic passing, and they thought that Elly's case was in good hands. But Paul and Nicole trusted the wrong people, and as time passed, they realized that Mozambique investigators, well, they weren't interested in the slightest in solving Elly's case. This began a never-ending cycle of turmoil for the Warren family, as the very people who were supposed to keep Mozambique safe from crime were the ones letting Elly's killer walk free. Now, here's the thing. Mozambique is a beautiful place, brimmed with natural resources and breathtaking natural scenery in the form of beaches and recreational areas. But it's also a country reeling from the repercussions of civil war. The key attractions of Mozambique include endless beaches and national parks, and these are the reasons why tourism is all the rage in the country, as well as a main source of revenue. People from all over the world fly to Mozambique to experience nature's works of art and leave in awe and appreciation, and this is exactly what Elly was doing. But as beautiful as Mozambique is, there is a lot of ugliness nestled in the roots of the country. According to approximately 55% of locals, most of the Mozambican police are corrupt. Police officers lack professionalism, work ethic, and they're quick to close cases that haven't even reached completion. Rather than properly solving a case, they just come up with some backward solution, claim it as the truth, and then close the case so that they can move on to the next one. Now, I can't say this with any certainty, but I'd be willing to bet that this happens in a lot of tourist locations. In fact, I used to live in a tourist city, and this was a pretty widely known theory that police covered up a lot of serious crimes or labeled them as less serious crimes because they didn't want to deter tourism. The next morning, a Wednesday, Elly's lifeless body was found by a local fisherman near or inside of a public block. See, this is where the Mozambican detectives are so inconsistent with the details, but this is just one of the many frustrating things that have surfaced in Elly's case. Initially, in Yemen police spokesperson Detective Juma Dauto ruled Elly's death as accidental, and even stressed that there was not a single mark, bruise, or cut on her body. The investigation was carried out at a snail's pace, which was very frustrating for the Warren family for obvious reasons. The first formal police report took almost 6 months to surface, and the details were appalling. According to it, Elly had passed away from a drug overdose. Now, what was really bizarre was the fact that there were no drugs in her system at the time of her passing, so this was highly suspicious. Meanwhile, Elly's parents tried to contact the Australian police, and they hoped that both investigative teams could work together to solve Elly's case. But Mozambique flat out refused. They said the investigation was theirs alone to handle. This was both shocking and infuriating. Elly's mom, Nicole, even launched a petition on change.org, asking the Australian Prime Minister, Scott Morrison, to help solve Elly's case and bring her justice. Within 2 weeks, the petition had over 36,000 signatures. As of recently, the petition is almost at 65,000, nearing its goal of 75,000 signatures. On the other hand, Mozambican detectives were of no help. See, after the initial police report, another one was released 4 days later, and this time it stated that Elly's passing was a homicide. But this is where things get even more confusing. Elly's cause of death was listed as mechanical asphyxiation, and the introduction of sandy contents into her lungs and mouth. Moreover, the sand found in Elly's body was loose beach sand, whereas the place where Elly's body was discovered was surrounded by dense, hard, and packed red dirt. So this leads to the assumption that Elly was attacked on the beach and that her body was moved. But why? And who did this? Well, that was exactly what Elly's parents wanted to find out. Once Elly's dad, Paul, saw how disinterested the Mozambican police were in solving Elly's case, and that they were being more of a hindrance than helpful in the investigation, he took matters into his own hands. 1 long year after Elly's tragic passing, Paul made the move to South Africa to find answers for himself. He had one goal alone, and that was to figure out who had done such a horrific thing to his poor and innocent daughter. Paul's actions are truly commendable, and Elly is so lucky to have a relentless and loving father like Paul, because even though he's now lost his daughter and his best friend, Paul is committed to catching the wrongdoer and bringing justice and peace to Elly. Paul didn't let his attention waver, and he was laser focused on finding clues about his daughter's terrible passing. And it didn't take him long. Surprisingly, he discovered more things about Elly's murder in a day than the detectives could in a year. It leads you to believe that the Mozambique authorities were either disinterested in solving Elly's case, or they wanted to protect their country's reputation because tourists disappearing and being found lifeless and humiliated in the streets of Mozambique doesn't necessarily scream safe. But the fact that Paul was able to uncover so much information in such a short amount of time, it led to one big question. Were the police truly uninterested, or was there a chance they may have been actively covering something up? Paul, on the second day that he arrived in Tofo, went to the resort where Elly was staying. What was so sad and heartbreaking was that he sat at the same table Elly was photographed at on her last day in Tofo, and he was unable to control his emotions and broke down crying while feeling connected to Elly in an almost spiritual way. It's something no father should ever have to go through. He even went around and put up notices asking for information, and within hours, lots of locals came forward, and Paul quickly found a very pivotal piece of information, but it was horrific to hear. See, a fisherman had forwarded a photo of Elly to Paul, and what he saw was truly a nightmare. It was a photo of Elly But sadly, she wasn't alive in the photo. Rather, she lay lifeless and disrobed with injuries to her face, neck, and limbs, implying that she fought for her life till the very end. For Paul, it was a terrible sight, seeing his daughter so helpless and humiliated. It was something he can't ever unsee, which is so tragic and unfortunate. The fact that Paul was forced to see something like this, he can't help but commend the fisherman for speaking up and being so forthcoming with information, but images like this aren't meant to be seen by family members, and it's so heartbreaking to know that Paul had to witness this firsthand, rather than investigators stepping in. But after seeing this photo, Paul realized something. Elly's body position and location were completely different from what Mozambique detectives passed forward to the Warren family. Initially, the Warren family believed that Elly was found near a public toilet block with no injuries, but this new photo led to the theory that someone had attacked Elly and then, unfortunately, taken her life at the beach. This also corroborated the presence of beach sand in Elly's body. Tragically, the photo also suggested something a lot more terrifying, and it was the fact that Elly had most definitely been taken advantage of, which makes the case so much darker. This photo, even though it was tragic and horrific, was proof that the local police were likely trying to cover up Elly's loss. But something else happened that solidified this theory. During Paul's time in Mozambique in 2017 and 2018, he came across locals who'd witnessed something very odd. A woman who was one of the people who found Elly's body was shown the photo of her body at the beach, the photo the fisherman had provided. The witness vividly remembered Elly being placed in a very peculiar position near the aforementioned toilet block. So, in this woman's eyes, how had Elly ended up on a beach in this photo? This proved that Elly's body was most definitely moved from the beach and it was placed near the toilet block. Interestingly, when her body was found near the toilet block, she was in a Muslim prayer position, with her backside jutted up and her face down, with her arms sprawled out in front of her head. The witness also went on to say that when she saw Elly by the toilet block, police officers had already arrived. This led to the theory that it was none other than the police officers who changed the location of Elly's body, so that it looked like an accident and not a homicide. The detectives wanted to make the scene look like an intoxicated Elly had tripped over a toilet block and passed away, or had been in the midst of prayer when she OD'd, or something of the sort. If this is true, then the local police officers must have obstructed the evidence, the actual crime scene, as well as Elly's body, which is unbelievable. But the burning question remained. Why? Why would the detectives do such a thing? And why would police officers cover up a crime scene? Were the police involved in Elly's passing, or were they doing the dirty work for someone far more sinister? By this time, the Australian police hadn't been involved in Elly's case, despite the countless appeals and requests made by the Warren family. But there was not a lot that Australian authorities could do, because Mozambique hadn't asked for their help, so Australian authorities weren't legally allowed to cross borders and help out, even if they wanted to. Clearly, the Mozambican police weren't doing a great job of solving Elly's highly suspicious crime. And when Paul eventually showed all of his findings to the local Mozambique police, believe it or not, they actually confessed that Elly's body was in fact moved. So why weren't they moving the case forward and finding the person who drove Elly to her fateful end? Well, it turned out that the authorities of Mozambique were in no rush at all to solve Elly's case, and shockingly, even after all the incriminating findings that came forth, Elly's case still saw no progress, and the Mozambique police basically wrote her off and ended their investigation. The Warren family was devastated by the actions of the Mozambican police and authorities, but that didn't stop them from trying everything they could. Elly's case received a lot of public attention, and it appeared on 60 Minutes Australia and multiple local news stations. And in 2020, someone did come to Paul's aid. It was a private German investigator, Nick Gregor. He was someone who worked closely to try to bring down criminal groups, illegal activities, and a heap of other sketchy things in Africa, as well as the Middle East. In 2020, the COVID-19 pandemic had locked down the world, so Nick and Paul couldn't go back to Mozambique. But Nick started his mission from home in Germany and kept Paul in the loop. He came in contact with various South African women who were involved in adult work to get inside information on the dangerous group in Tofo. One woman believed that this group was involved in Elly's passing, and this gang of criminals was highly suspicious, to put it mildly. Nick was informed of a drug dealing gang that also dabbled in robbery and other violent crimes. They were so violent and so powerful that even the police were at their beck and call. Essentially, this gang ran Tofo, and there was nothing the police could do about it. They were outnumbered and overpowered. Nick knew that he had to get more information, so he had virtual meetings with different women, either with backgrounds in criminal activity or who were previously involved in the gang. Nick knew he was playing with fire, but he was an expert in his line of work, and he knew that the Warren family needed answers. So he went through a long list of women and finally came across one who seemed perfect for a secretive inside investigation into the gang. Nick assigned the woman with the task to befriend members of the gang and get a confession out of them about whether they had any hand in Elly's passing or not. And sure enough, after 2 weeks of trying to get into the good books of the gang, the crime lord talked, and unbeknownst to the boss, the woman was recording him. He confessed to distributing illegal substances, robbing tourists, and even driving people to their deaths. His confession was vague, and he didn't necessarily mention Elly by name, but he was known to lure tourists and take advantage of them in more scary ways than one, so it wouldn't be above him to commit such a heinous act. We know this gang was operating in the area at the time that Elly lost her life, and we know that he was more than willing to take advantage of young women while they were in the area, so the pieces certainly fit. The woman immediately relayed the information to Nick, and as of now, the running theory is that Elly was approached by the members of the Tofo gang at the beach, who proceeded to rob her, among other things. When Elly resisted, they overpowered her, took advantage of her, and violently ended her life. Afterwards, her body was taken to a nearby public toilet block and was framed to look like an accident, and the police even went along with their actions and proceeded to cover up the whole thing. Now, keep in mind, this is just a theory, but if it has any truth at all, and let's be honest, it probably does, then imagine how corrupt the Mozambican police really are. They're ready to cover up a crime scene and make it look like something entirely different without any blow to their conscience. It's so terrifying to imagine what the residents of Mozambique have to endure, knowing that the detectives will do nothing for bringing their people justice, and they can simply sweep things under the rug, dust their hands off, and act like nothing happened. For those of you watching who live in the Western world, you know that oftentimes our own police can be pretty corrupt. They cover things up for their own personal gain, and the true story likely never comes out. At least, not most of the time. But to see that the Mozambican police are so upfront about this, so out in the open, and no one can do a single thing about it, it's beyond terrifying. Once Paul got all of the information from Nick, he made a beeline for the Australian embassy in South Africa and demanded that they do something. The facts were clear as day, and even though Mozambique would never invite Australian police for a formal investigation, the Australian police could wiggle their way into African territory if there was political pressure, and that's exactly what happened. In February of 2021, 5 years after constant back and forth, the Warren family finally received some good news for the first time in a very long time. Paul received a call from the Australian Federal Police, and he was told that they were officially ordered to investigate Elly's death in Mozambique. With the Australian Federal Police involved in Elly's case after years had passed, the Warren family could finally see their daughter's case reaching its end. But it's still far from over. The inquest is still ongoing, and even though a lot of time has passed, Paul is still hopeful that he and his grieving family will get answers. Paul went through a lot of pain and suffering during his quest for answers. Paul, alongside fighting for justice for Elly, is also adamant about bringing changes to the law, especially those concerning cross-country and cross-continent deaths. He's vocal in bringing changes to international laws and the quickening pace of investigations of people passing away in other countries and other continents of the world. If the Australian police had intervened sooner, this painful torment could have subsided for the Warren family. The Mozambican detectives botched Elly's case from the get-go, and it seems like they did so on purpose. We don't know if it was out of fear of the gang or to protect their own country's reputation, but what we do know is that regardless of the reason, the authorities were unprofessional, unethical, and immoral. The Mozambique police are at fault through and through. There's no denying that. The actions of the Mozambican detectives led to devastating consequences for the Warren family, who are trying to salvage whatever closure they can from this mess of an investigation. Elly's case, even after 8 long and grueling years, is still open. Even though there's a strong suspicion of the Tofo criminal gang being involved in Elly's passing, real and legitimate answers can only be given by the investigators of the AFP, who are now involved in Elly's case. I feel very confident that in due time, Elly's case will be solved. And this is another one of those incredible, unfortunate cases where we basically know exactly what happened, but we just have to prove it so that justice can be served. And proving it is often the most difficult task. After all was said and done, Elly's ashes were scattered on the water at a local beach in Melbourne, which was Elly's favorite place to visit with her dad. Everyone who loved Elly showed up at her memorial to say their final goodbyes to a fighter, a nature lover, and a free-spirited young woman whose life was snatched from her so brutally. In Mozambique, Paul also set up a monument of sorts so that people don't forget Elly and what tragedy fell on her. Elly was a soul who craved adventure, and her life was cut short so barbarically. Only when the wrongdoers pay for what they did to poor Elly will the Warren family finally get the closure they need to move on with their lives after this tragic and sudden loss. And I, for one, can't wait to see that day. Life can be bland without companions. This is why we have family and friends and people who don't judge us, love us unconditionally, and are always there for us. But how well do we actually know our friends? Keeley Bunker, after a late night out on September 19th of 2019, was heading home to be well rested for a job interview later that day. Now, considering the direction this case took, you would think that she was walking alone at night, which is many people's worst fear. But she wasn't. Her friend was walking with her, someone she trusted to keep her safe. But if that's so, then why didn't Keeley make it to her interview? Why was she reported missing the same evening? What happened to her on September 19th of 2019 when she was just 20 minutes away from her home, and that too with a friend? The case of Keeley Bunker is darker and much more twisted than meets the eye, and it's a horrific tale of betrayal coming from where it's least expected. Keeley Bunker was born on September 7, 1999, to parents Christopher Bunker and Deborah Watkins in Sutton Coldfield, West Midlands, England. Keeley was described as a kind, compassionate, and loving girl. She had a very giving personality and wasn't afraid to put others first. When she was older, she helped her aunt to look after her cousin, who unfortunately had severe disabilities, along with her aunt's other children, just to make their lives easier. That's how helpful, kind, and generous Keeley was. She loved people around her unconditionally, and was a breath of fresh air for most people that knew her. As Keeley had experience taking care of children, and it helped that she loved being around them, Keeley had dreams of becoming a school teacher. Her family said that there wasn't a more fitting profession perfectly tailored for Keeley than teaching. At the time of this case, Keeley resided in Tamworth, Staffordshire, and worked at the Drayton Manor theme park while working on making her dreams of teaching a reality. In school and shortly thereafter, Keeley was considered quite popular, but even so, she was very down to earth. She loved music as well, specifically the British rapper H. Sometime before the 18th of September 2019, Keeley had actually bought concert tickets to see H perform at the O2 Arena in Birmingham as a birthday treat for herself. Keeley was excited to no end, but just 12 days after her 20th birthday, while out with her friends, something horrible would happen to Keeley, and it would become one of the most terrifying tragedies of Tamworth. After celebrating her 20th birthday, Keeley and one of her close friends, Monique Riggin, went to see H's live performance at the O2 Arena in Birmingham on September 18th of 2019. Keeley had a blast with a friend by her side, but after the concert ended, Keeley wasn't ready to call it a night just yet. At around 10 p.m., the duo decided to hit a nearby club. But before they reached the club, they made a stop at the New Street station to meet up with one of Keeley's friends, 20-year-old Wesley Street. Wesley was a childhood friend of Keeley's, and the two had known each other since they were little. They had mutual friends, and even though they didn't hang out much, Keeley wanted to invite Wesley for a fun night out, since they'd recently reconnected. Together, the trio reached a nightclub called Snobs, located in Tamworth, at around 10:40 p.m., and all of them had a fun time with drinks and dancing. For the next 4 hours or so, Keeley had a couple of drinks, but was supposedly being quite responsible with her drinking. Wesley, on the other hand, went a bit wild. Finally, at 2:40 a.m., the friends decided to call it a night, and Monique proceeded to call a taxi to her house in Tamworth. Now, Monique and Keeley actually lived pretty close to each other. Their houses were about a 20-minute walk away from each other, so it was all good. During the cab ride, Wesley had to make a stop in the middle because he wasn't feeling well. But finally, at about 3:30 a.m., the trio reached Monique's home. Since it was pretty late at that point, Monique asked if Keeley wanted to spend the night at her house. But Keeley declined the offer, as she had an interview for the position of assistant teacher at a local school at around 2 p.m. that same day. Even though Monique was still worried about Keeley getting home safely, she assured her by saying, quote, "I've got Wes, I'll be fine. I'll walk with him and I'll be safe." Wesley also lived close to Keeley, so the plan was perfect. Keeley didn't have to walk alone at night, and she had her friend by her side. Anyway, at around 4 a.m., Keeley and Wesley left Monique's house, and Monique pleaded with Wesley to take Keeley home safely, and he assured her that he would, even though he was supposedly incredibly drunk. Fast forward to the later hours of September 19th of 2019, and Keeley's family was waiting for an update from Keeley about her night out and the interview, but they got no response from her. To make matters worse, by 6 or 7 a.m. that morning, Keeley still hadn't made it home. This is when they started to panic. Around 12:30 p.m., Monique also called Keeley to find out whether she'd reached home safely or not, but she got no answer or any message back from her. This radio silence from Keeley immediately prompted Monique to call Wesley. She thought that maybe Keeley had spent the night with him. Wesley answered the phone and said that Keeley wasn't with him. When asked about walking Keeley back home a couple hours ago, Wesley went on to explain that as they left Monique's house, he had to stop by his house as he was feeling nauseous again. Wesley left Keeley outside his home near a telephone box, and he assumed that Keeley walked by herself the rest of the way. Wesley thought that Keeley would be fine, but now, after talking to Monique and knowing that Keeley was nowhere to be found, he was feeling terrible for leaving her alone, and naturally so. He had one job. So Wesley, Monique, and Cameron Marsden, who was a close friend of Wesley, went out to look for her in the surrounding areas, but there was no sign of Keeley. Their fears were doubled when they learned that Keeley never showed up for the interview at 2 p.m. This was not normal for Keeley at all. She'd waited her whole life for this dream job, and she would miss it for the world. Monique immediately had a sinking feeling that something was not right. At around 5:30 p.m., Christopher, Keeley's dad, came home, and after still not hearing from Keeley all day, he immediately filed a missing person report, and Keeley was officially a missing person. The police immediately jumped into action once Keeley was reported missing. A 20-year-old girl who was living a good life and had an interview for a job that was perfect for her couldn't have just up and left. Keeley's disappearance shook the community of Tamworth, and everyone took part in the search for her. At around 9 p.m., it was getting dark, but the search for Keeley was still on, and people were using flashlights to look for something, anything, that could lead to Keeley. When the search party reached Wigington Park, that's when people heard a horrifying scream. An off-duty investigative officer named Dean Reynolds, who had also had a military background, described the scream as the most horrendous and fearful sound he'd ever heard. What was even more painful was that Jason Brown, Keeley's uncle, was the one who screamed, and that was because he discovered something that he didn't want to see. Even though it was dark, Jason wanted to look around Wigington Park, and when he reached a small and shallow pond, that's when he saw something. It was a body partially immersed in the pond, and when Jason shone some light on the body, something caught his eye. It was a glimmering of a bracelet, the same bracelet that Keeley always wore. When detectives and emergency services reached the pond, unfortunately, 20-year-old Keeley Bunker had already lost her life. Keeley's body was taken for an autopsy, and the news of her passing was given to her parents, who couldn't even believe what they were hearing. Their daughter had just turned 20 days ago, but now she was gone. Keeley's friends were also informed of her passing, and Monique was struck with incredible grief. She was battling with the gnawing feeling of sadness and guilt. She thought that she could have just forced Keeley to stay with her and then she'd still be alive. It was just unbelievable. The autopsy revealed several disturbing details about Keeley's passing. She was disrobed, and there were signs of violation, which is just so heartbreaking to imagine what Keeley went through before her tragic demise. There were also a lot of defensive wounds on her body, mainly on her neck and arms, and her cause of death was compression to the neck. Now that the case had taken a grim turn from a missing person investigation to a full-blown homicide investigation, the police knew that they had to catch the perpetrator, and fast. Given the timeline and series of events a few hours before Keeley went missing, the investigators knew that they had to talk to the last person she came in contact with, and that was none other than Wesley Street. The police arrived at Wesley's home in Tamworth, and they just wanted to ask a couple of questions. They even took Wesley in the patrol car to help find the exact spot where he left Keeley a few hours prior. Now, this detail doesn't make much sense to me, because according to what Wesley told Monique, he left Keeley just outside the front of his house near a telephone box, but now he was having officers drive him around the area so that he could show them where he left her. I'm not sure if this detail was simply misreported by a news outlet, or if there's something more to this, but this detail seemed important to point out. At first, the detectives weren't suspicious of Wesley, as he was trying his best to cooperate. But a few minutes into the car ride, the investigators asked Wesley for his phone, but Wesley refused to hand it over. After a bit of coercion from the police, Wesley did what he was asked, but he proceeded to get defensive, saying that he felt as though the police were blaming him and that they thought he was the suspect. Now, this is extremely alarming. If your childhood friend had gone missing, you would try to do everything in your power to find them and help the authorities as much as you can, not get defensive about it. This behavior could be the result of one of two scenarios. Either Wesley was freaking out being questioned by the detectives, or he may have had a hand in what happened to Keeley and was trying to save his skin. Needless to say, if the police weren't suspicious of Wesley before, they certainly were now. Anyway, all of this was going on at the same time that the search parties were looking for Keeley, and when Keeley's body was discovered, the investigators knew that Wesley's behavior wasn't weird for no reason. While still in the cop car, just a couple of hours into the search for Keeley, Wesley was arrested on suspicion of taking her life, and he was taken to the police station, where he was officially interrogated for the crime. Mind you, at this point, the evidence police had was quite shaky. Best I can tell, they had little more than a gut feeling about this man, simply because he'd been acting so strangely. Regardless, his DNA was taken and sent off to be compared with the DNA that was found on Keeley's body. What was odd was the fact that Wesley changed his story every single time new evidence was brought in front of him, which made him even more suspicious. First, he denied any involvement in Keeley's passing and said that they never engaged in intercourse and that they went straight home from the nightclub. But this story soon hit a wall when Wesley's phone records showed that a cell phone tower pinged close to the location of Wigington Park on the 19th of September after 4 a.m., confirming that he was indeed in Wigington Park. So there was no way that his story was true. This is when Wesley proceeded to change his tone. He told the detectives that he and Keeley did end up going to Wigington Park after leaving Monique's house, but they were a bit drunk, and Wesley playfully jumped on Keeley's back, causing her to trip and hit her head on a fence post, leading to her demise. But this story was quickly thrown to the side very quickly by detectives, as Keeley's autopsy confirmed there was no injury or blunt force trauma to her head, and her blood alcohol levels were lower than the legal driving limit. She may have been a bit drunk, but she wasn't nearly as intoxicated as he was. During this time, the DNA results came out too, and the DNA found on Keeley's body matched that of Wesley. So with this evidence, Wesley couldn't deny the fact that they had engaged in some sort of sexual activity that night. What the police wanted to confirm now was whether it was consensual or not. With that revelation, you guessed it, Wesley came up with another story. This time he said that while they were heading towards the park, Keeley was apparently giving Wesley flirty eyes. One thing led to another and they got intimate in Wigington Park. Wesley proceeded to say that during their consensual intercourse, he was holding Keeley's neck in an act of passion when he suddenly felt her body going limp. He tried to wake her up, but she passed away. This caused Wesley to panic, and he dumped Keeley's body in the nearby pond. Now, I just want to push back on this claim for just a moment, because claiming someone's life by strangulation is not like what you see in the movies. It's not something that can just happen without you realizing what's going on. It's not something that can happen in a matter of seconds either. It takes a tremendous amount of force and a surprisingly long amount of time. You wouldn't just feel someone going limp and let go and then realize it's too late. You'd have to feel them going limp, then keep at it for a couple more minutes, maybe even longer, depending on the person. But anyway, according to Wesley's story, after this supposedly accidental act, he made his way back home where he proceeded to take a shower and sleep. And it's just so chilling to know how unbothered Wesley was, knowing that he'd taken his childhood friend's life and all he cared about was getting a good night's rest. But that's all operating under the assumption that his story was even completely true, and I personally don't buy it. Regardless, Wesley later confessed that during the early morning hours, he went back to the scene where Keeley's body was about 5 times to cover her up with branches and twigs so that no one would discover her. When the investigators asked why he didn't come clean about this from the get-go about what actually happened, Wesley gave the most baffling answer. He simply said that he was embarrassed and afraid and didn't know how to tell people how Keeley had actually died. Now, even though Wesley had confessed to taking Keeley's life, although by accident, well, the police were now getting a bit suspicious. Wesley's statements still contradicted the evidence that was found on Keeley's body. For starters, the defense wounds on Keeley's neck suggested that she was trying to loosen the hold that Wesley had on her, just like I described a moment ago. There's no plausible scenario when you can accidentally strangle someone. Whatever happened that night, it was not an accident, and it was not consensual. Also, when the clothes Wesley wore on that fateful night on Keeley's passing were tested, there were traces of Keeley's makeup, saliva, and even blood on the edge of the sleeves. All of this evidence suggested that whatever happened to Keeley was extremely brutal, and Wesley had every intention of ending Keeley's life. Up until Wesley's trial in July of 2020, he maintained his innocence and deemed Keeley's loss as an accident. But the prosecution wanted Wesley to receive punishment for what he did. Since Wesley was of no help and didn't come forth with a motive for ending Keeley's life, the police had no choice but to theorize it. They thought that Wesley was attracted to Keeley. Keeley was a beautiful, lively, and friendly young woman, the type of person nearly anyone could fall for quite quickly. Police theorized that after leaving Monique's house, Keeley and Wesley made their way to Wigington Park, and during that time, Wesley tried to make advances towards her. Keeley, who didn't feel the same about Wesley, turned him down. Now, this was just something that seriously angered Wesley. Wesley didn't want to hear the word no, and this was what caused Wesley to tackle Keeley to the ground, subdue her, and take advantage of her, all the while squeezing her neck. Keeley tried to put up a fight to make Wesley stop, which was when she was inflicted with defensive wounds. But in the end, Keeley unfortunately lost her life, and that too at the hands of her trusted friend, a friend who was supposed to protect her. On the flip side, the defense stuck to the accidental stance, and they tried to persuade the court by saying that Wesley and Keeley engaged in consensual activities, and Keeley was apparently, quote, enjoying herself. There was also an instance caught on CCTV that showed Wesley and Keeley going to the park, and it seemed like Keeley may have been pushing Wesley away. But according to Wesley and the defense, it was innocent play fighting. As for the prosecution, they had one more revelation to present to the jury, and this would determine whether what Wesley did was truly an accident or intentional. Ever since the news of Keeley's death and Wesley's arrest was made public, and the investigation was still ongoing, a number of women came forward with their horrific encounters with none other than Wesley himself. One young woman came forward and confessed that in 2015, she was only 16 years old, and Wesley followed her into a bathroom, locked the door behind them, and forced her to perform indecent acts on him. But that wasn't the end for this poor girl, because she was cornered by Wesley again a couple of days following the first incident and forced himself on her again. Another young girl came forward and claimed to have been victimized by Wesley back in 2017 when she was also underage. In 2019, just months before Keeley's tragic passing, Wesley targeted another woman who was 20 years old, and his MO was pretty much the same. It's heartbreaking that none of these women came forward sooner, but the fear these young girls likely felt is unlike anything you could imagine, so it's certainly understandable. These women were very brave to come forward with what they endured at the hands of an evil man, and thanks to them, this case was about to get as simple as one could be. But it does beg two very alarming questions. How many women and minors did Wesley actually terrorize and violate? And could there be more of Wesley's victims out there who are still afraid to come forward? After the jury deliberated for 8 hours, which is a surprising amount of time considering the evidence, they came forward with their decision. Wesley Street was found guilty of all charges, including the charges he now faced regarding the minors that he forced himself on. He was sentenced to a minimum of 30 years behind bars, but he will be eligible for parole after that time, which is terrifying to hear. Keeley was a beautiful young woman who had lots of plans for her future. But everything came crashing down on the very day that she was looking forward to for so many years. She finally had made it. Her dream job was just an interview away, and Wesley stole that from both Keeley and her family. Keeley's parents had a hard time wrapping their heads around the fact that Wesley, a young man that they considered to be like family, had such a dark side to him, and they never even anticipated that this man could take the life of their beloved daughter and ruin the lives of so many other daughters. After the sentencing, Keeley's family said the following, saying, quote, "As Keeley's family, the outcome of this trial will never be enough in terms of justice. Keeley was the kindest, most caring, innocent young lady you could ever meet, and was only just starting out in her life. Such is the hell we feel. We're incapable of showing any forgiveness." On October 24th, 2019, Keeley's funeral was held at St. Edith's Church in Tamworth, and her parents requested attendees to pay homage to their daughter by pairing their black attire with something pink, as it was Keeley's favorite color. Hundreds of people, including friends, family, and close relatives, gathered to bid farewell to a girl with such a promising future. The case of Keeley Bunker depicts the alternate and very dark side of supposed friendships. It leaves you wondering whether you can trust a friend with your life or not. Keeley trusted Wesley to walk her home safely, but rather, he led her straight into the hands of danger. And this was the worst betrayal a friend could ever receive. We can only imagine how Keeley felt during her last moments, fighting for her life to get away from the person she trusted so deeply. In the end, Wesley managed to backstab all of the people who loved him like family. And for what? To what end? We can only hope that Keeley's family is, after these years, learning to heal from this tragedy and living their lives while trying to come to terms with the enduring loss of their wonderful daughter. Have you ever tried to grab onto something that you felt was so close, but as soon as you reached for it, it suddenly drifted away? It's a disappointing feeling. But what if it never ends? Susan Billig knew what it felt like when feelings of hope and despair mixed together, especially when her 17-year-old daughter Amy went missing from Coconut Grove, Florida, never to be seen again. Amy Billig was born on January 9, 1957, in Oyster Bay, New York City, to parents Ned Solomon and Susan Billig, after multiple failed pregnancies. It's safe to say that Amy was Susan and Ned's miracle baby. But just a year after Amy was born, the family welcomed a baby boy, Joshua, on February 14, 1958. When Amy was 11 and Josh was 10, the Billig family moved from New York to southern Florida due to the increasing crime rate in the city. Amy's parents owned an art gallery near Commodore Plaza, and both Amy and Josh attended private schools. Amy was the human form of 1970s culture. She was easy to get along with because she was so gentle and caring. She loved to sing and played instruments like the flute and guitar. She was religious and belonged to the Jewish faith. She also loved reading and writing and kept a diary in which she wrote a ton of poetry. Amy also loved animals and was a vegetarian by choice. Given her gifted creativity, Amy had aspirations of becoming an actress. Amy, being born in the 70s, was the epitome of a flower child. She had a free spirit and would frequently hike to places and make friends with pretty much anyone. On March 31st, 1974, Amy was awaiting her graduation from Adelphi Academy of Coral Gables and wanted to follow her dreams of becoming an actress. But a few weeks before she could celebrate her graduation, Amy was nowhere to be seen, and her disappearance would shake the entire community of Coconut Grove. On March 5th, 1974, Amy returned home from school after a normal Tuesday and wanted to meet some friends later on that day. When she returned home, she called her father at his art gallery from their home landline to ask if she could borrow some money from him for lunch with her friends at Peacock Park. Her father, Ned, agreed, and Amy changed into a denim skirt and cork platform sandals. She grabbed her camera, which she always took with her wherever she went, and proceeded to hitchhike to her father's gallery, which was less than a mile away. Now, hitchhiking wasn't uncommon at the time that this case took place. It was the 1970s. People used to hitchhike all the time. It was relatively safe. Remember, people seldom even locked their doors at night, and security cameras were a rarity. My parents were actually growing up during this time period, and my mom once told me the story about her and her family going on vacation for a week, then coming back home to find their front door unlocked and wide open. No one had broken in. The family had just forgotten to shut the door before leaving. Not a single item in that house was touched, even after being left wide open for a full week. That's the type of atmosphere we're talking about here, and it can be easy to forget those days when we think of them in the context of how bad things have gotten in the present day. But this perception of safety soon changed for the Billig family, because Amy had now disappeared. She never reached her father's gallery to get the money that she wanted. 17-year-old Amy Billig essentially disappeared from Coconut Grove and was never seen again. Around the evening of that same day, Susan and Josh began to worry because Amy hadn't returned home. This behavior was not normal for Amy at all. Their fears doubled when Ned returned home and confirmed that Amy never came to the gallery. Susan also called Amy's friends and was horrified to learn that Amy never made it to lunch with her friends either. This caused panic within the Billig family, and the police were immediately called. The police tried to reassure Susan that Amy would return, and Detective Michael Gonzalez said, quote, "Don't panic, call back if Amy isn't home by morning." While waiting on pens and needles, March 6th rolled around. At 6 a.m., a frantic Susan called the police, and finally, an official search for Amy began. While investigating and asking people around the area where Amy could have been, the police found a lead. Some construction workers had seen Amy get into a white van in the early afternoon in Coconut Grove, close to her home. The community was tight-knit, and everyone immediately was concerned for Amy and her safety, as she didn't return home even after multiple days had passed. On March 18th, 13 days after Amy was last seen, a camera tossed on the grass beside the Wildwood exit on Florida's Turnpike was recovered by a hitchhiking college student. This area was about 250 miles northwest of Miami. When the camera was taken in as evidence and shown to the Billig family, they confirmed that it was indeed Amy's camera. The police wanted to take a look at the photos, so they were sent for development. But most of the photos led to nothing, as they were extremely overexposed and nothing could be made out. But two photos stood out to the police. They were of a light-colored, possibly white pickup truck in front of a building covered in vines. If you remember, Amy was seen by construction workers getting into a white van, so this may have been a clue in the right direction. It's unknown, though, whether the developed pictures were from the same day when Amy disappeared or not, but the police had something nonetheless. Investigators held on to this sliver of evidence, but they couldn't identify the building or the white vehicle, since the picture didn't have any information like street numbers or license plates. Susan pleaded with the police officers to inspect Amy's room for evidence of any fingerprints, because she believed that whoever took Amy might have been someone close to her. But the police initially thought that Amy was a runaway and didn't bother to check for any fingerprints. After some time, though, when it was clear that Amy hadn't run away and that someone had possibly abducted her, the police finally went to Amy's house to check for fingerprints. Unfortunately, though, given the humidity and classic Florida weather, the fingerprints were gone. This was a huge blunder on the police's part because they lost a chance of finding something that could explain Amy's disappearance. Susan, trying her hardest to find her daughter, started her own investigation on the side and hired a private investigator to help her find Amy. Susan and Ned were trying their best to spread the word of Amy's disappearance. They printed posters in English and in Spanish, held a vigil for Amy, and went door to door for any information or sighting of Amy, and called the Miami PD almost daily for updates on the case. Susan spent her free time in Amy's room, trying to reconnect with her daughter, because she missed her terribly. But while in her room one day, Susan took a peek at Amy's diary, and she found an entry that sent shivers down her spine. 6 weeks before Amy disappeared, she wrote in her diary that she'd made plans with a man named Hank to go to South America. She even called the idea crazy. Now, this entry left Susan rather uneasy. Amy was very close with her family, and she almost always shared everything with her mother. So why didn't she ever say anything about this Hank guy, or having plans to go to South America? This detail is pertinent, and it comes back later in the case, so stick around. 16 days following Amy's disappearance, Susan received a call from two twin brothers, 16-year-old Charles and Larry Glasser. They said that they had kidnapped Amy and demanded $30,000 in ransom. The police followed this lead immediately, and on March 22nd, the callers were arrested from a local hotel. Susan was hopeful that Amy was soon going to be with her family, but the boys didn't have her. They were lying and trying to cash in on the helplessness of the Billig family. The boys were charged with extortion and they pleaded guilty. This sent the police back to square one. Following the unsuccessful lead of the Glasser twins, Susan received multiple leads daily, all of which led this poor woman on a wild goose chase. But multiple believable leads involved something very dark: the entailment that Amy had been abducted by a biker gang, either by the Outlaws or the Pagans. The reason why this lead was plausible was that biker gangs had a dark history of abusing women for, well, all the obvious reasons that they would want to do that. The leads were solidified when someone said that they'd seen Amy getting on a bike with someone who looked like a member of the gang on the day that she disappeared. In the 1970s, the Outlaws and the Pagans were the two main biker gangs roaming the streets of Coconut Grove, and it was believed that they had abducted Amy and were holding her hostage. Susan had no choice but to follow these leads, and they led her to a local convenience store in the Orlando area. The store manager looked at Amy's photo and immediately recalled a very specific incident. She claimed to have seen a girl resembling Amy with two men who looked like bikers, coming to the store and buying vegetable soup. Now, this specific detail caused Susan's ears to perk up, because Amy, as mentioned, was a vegetarian. The store manager also said that the girl hardly spoke and was referred to by the bikers as Mute, or Little Bit, and Mellow Cheryl. This encounter solidified the biker gang theory, and before you know it, Susan, with no fear for her life, tried to talk to members of the biker gang to get any information of her missing daughter. In January of 1976, Susan was approached by an ex-member of a biker gang, Paul, and they agreed to go to his house in order to give Susan information on Amy. Paul told Susan that he had owned Amy while she was in the gang. He also said that the girl was submissive, quiet, and almost mute, which, if you remember, is the same thing that the convenience store manager in Orlando said too. He told Susan that Amy was still alive, but being held hostage by the gang. Understandably, Susan was apprehensive to believe Paul at first. For confirmation, she asked for Amy's physical description, or any unique characteristic. And what Paul said was truly shocking. He confirmed that Amy had a scar on her abdomen, a detail that only Susan knew and something that was not public information. This stunned Susan, and she eventually believed Paul's claims. Not long after, Paul contacted Susan again with highly encouraging news. He said that Amy was in a bar in Tulsa, a very dangerous bar that bikers frequented. But Susan was ready to risk everything if it meant that she would have her daughter safe with her. Susan met up with Paul at the bar, but as soon as Paul left to talk to someone, a huge brawl broke out. Susan was utterly terrified, and before she could even comprehend what was happening, she was escorted back by another biker member to a taxi, apparently waiting to take her back to her hotel, leading to another dead end. Paul, though, contacted Susan's attorney not long after, and again he said that Amy was now in Seattle, and even though Susan had recently suffered from a heart attack, she packed up and went to Seattle. But it was unfruitful, and even though people did remember seeing a submissive, mute girl, there was no sign of Amy. Now, we don't know whether all of this was done to mess with Susan or if Amy really was kidnapped by a biker gang, and Paul was trying his best to reunite a mother with his daughter with the information he had. But in late 1992, Susan was contacted by a local private investigator, Virginia Schneider, who was working with another private investigator in England on an unrelated case. Turns out the PI was approached in a post office in Falmouth, England, by a man who looked like a biker, with all the tattoos and rugged appearance, and asked the PI if he wanted a girl. When asked about what kind of girl the biker was talking about, he said that it was a mute American girl from Oyster Bay. Now, if you remember, Amy was originally born in Oyster Bay, and strangely, everyone who seemed to have seen Amy or a girl resembling her defined her in the exact same way. A year later after this incident, though, this lead almost hit a brick wall because the PI in England passed away. And after this, there was no more information on Amy or her whereabouts. But some incriminating things did surface in the years that followed. Fast forward to 1997. Paul's widow came to detectives with some very disturbing details about Amy. It was a confession from Paul before he passed away. He said that the biker gang was responsible for Amy's disappearance, but added that they'd now also taken her life. Paul went on to confess that Amy was taken to a party of the pagans in the Everglades, where she was taken advantage of by a large group of bikers, with this being spurred because Amy allegedly insulted them. The intent wasn't to end Amy's life, rather it was supposedly to teach her a lesson. But when Amy fought back, the bikers drugged her into submission and accidentally overdosed her. The members of the gang then proceeded to dispose of Amy's body in a nearby swamp, which was believed to have been infested with alligators, which is why she was never found. Now, this could have been a hoax, and maybe Paul's widow was saying all of this for media attention. But we can only imagine what went through Susan's mind when she heard about all this. She was trying so hard to not let go of the hope that Amy was alive, but it was getting harder and harder. It's just so heartbreaking to see Susan go through these bouts of hope and then despair, and to see her grieving while never losing hope that Amy was still out there and alive. It's truly unbelievable. But there was one more distressing thing that had happened behind the scenes, and it turned this rather confusing case right on its head. So, a few months after Amy's disappearance, Susan, who was busy trying to find her daughter somewhere in the dark hole that was this biker gang, started receiving very bizarre phone calls from someone who was later found to be a man. Sometimes no one spoke on the other end of the line, and other times there would just be heavy breathing. Unfortunately, the police could never trace the calls, as most of them were made from a local payphone. Since there was no security cameras either, it was really hard to determine who this mysterious caller was. Even after narrowing the payphone location down, the police held stakeouts in hopes to catch the treacherous caller. But still, it seemed as though this caller had found out information about this because he never showed up to the same payphone again and resumed calling Susan from another payphone. The caller contacted and tormented Susan for almost 21 years, with a varying pattern. Sometimes Susan received 7 to 8 calls a day from the caller, whereas other times there would be lapses of months in between calls. Regardless, it was terrifying and emotionally draining to Susan to no end. Almost 5 months into the call stalking, the caller said the following words: "I have her. This is Johnson." Before Susan could ask Johnson anything, though, he would abruptly hang up. On calls, Johnson even agreed to meet Susan twice, but you guessed it, he never showed up. Johnson, if that even was the caller's real name, called and drove Susan insane with very chilling details about Amy, saying things like, "Hurry up, you have little time. Amy has 2 weeks to live," and "Wow, Amy looks magnificent right now." Now, some people thought that this was just a very sick prank, but Johnson knew a lot about the Billig family. For instance, he knew that Susan's husband, Ned, had passed away in 1992, and Johnson called Susan shortly after saying, quote, "You're all alone now, aren't you? You better watch out." I wish I could tell you that this was a scene from a terrifying movie, but unfortunately, it wasn't. Susan was living in a perpetual nightmare. Enduring this 2-decade-long terror while trying to find her daughter was absolutely draining for Susan, and you can only imagine her mental and emotional state during this time. She was going in circles with no results, which was understandably frustrating. But in 1993, everything changed, and finally, Susan got to hear some good news for the first time in a while. See, in 1993, Johnson started to use a cell phone to contact Susan, which finally led to the call getting traced by the FBI. On November 17, 1995, a 48-year-old man named Henry Johnson Blair was arrested. He was the man who'd haunted Susan with his cryptic phone calls for 21 years. Henry Johnson Blair was born in 1947 and was a married father of 2 daughters who suffered from OCD and alcohol abuse. He worked for the United States Customs Service for 24 years. So, was Amy with Henry? Did Susan finally get her daughter back after 21 long years? Well, unfortunately, the answer to both of these questions was no. Henry claimed that he didn't even know who Amy was and said that he got sexual pleasure from making hoax calls and that he was only messing with Susan. He also claimed to call and torment other families whose loved ones had gone missing. He essentially blamed everything on his OCD and alcohol abuse. Now, all of this seemed highly convincing. First of all, suffering from OCD and alcohol abuse is bad enough, but that's no excuse to torment a helpless woman, especially with disgusting remarks about her missing daughter. And that too for 21 years. Even a sick prank should never go that far. So something definitely seemed fishy about Henry's statement. And to everyone's surprise, soon more things surfaced. Remember Amy's diary entry? Well, it turns out that Henry's nickname was coincidentally Hank. To add to the pile of eerie coincidences, Henry, aka Hank, was relocated to none other than South America for his job, and it was strangely right around the time when Amy wrote about going there in her diary. Now, I don't know about you, but it couldn't be a coincidence that Amy had plans to go to South America with a man named Hank out of all the places in the world. And if that wasn't weird enough, the white pickup truck from the developed photos and Amy's camera looked like the same vehicle and model that Henry drove at that time. All of those revelations pin Henry as the main suspect. So was it possible that Amy actually did know Henry? Did Amy unknowingly leave a clue behind that could possibly lead to answers about what might have happened to her? Well, to everyone's surprise, Henry was never linked to Amy's disappearance, even though there was so much evidence to claim otherwise. In the end, Henry was charged with 2 counts of aggravated stalking and was given just 2 years in prison. Susan even filed a lawsuit against Henry for harassing her for so many years, and it was eventually settled for $5 million. Even though we don't know the possible motive Henry might have had, it's still strange to see so many eerie details coincide. Even though nothing officially pinned Henry as the person behind Amy's disappearance, it's safe to say that Henry was definitely more involved in Amy's life than he was letting on. The photos of the white van, Henry's nickname, and him relocating to South America around the same time Amy had plans to go there with so-called Hank can't be mere coincidences. It could be possible that they'd met before and sparked a friendship of sorts. Maybe that friendship morphed into obsession, especially on Henry's part. This could explain why he terrorized Susan for so many years after Amy's disappearance. While the biker gang theory was based on hearsay with no solid leads, Amy's diary entry and the revelations involving Henry that came to light were anything but ordinary. But Henry never did come forward with any explanation for the photos of the white truck or van, or Amy's diary entry, and eventually he passed away in 2006 at the age of 59 in Florida. Susan never received any calls from Amy, and there was only inconclusive leads. So is Amy really out there, still in the clutches of a biker gang? Did Amy meet her tragic end in the Everglades? Or did Henry, aka Hank, get away with what's essentially a slap on the wrist for Amy's disappearance and apparent demise and take his secrets to the grave with him? There are just too many questions, and unfortunately not a single answer. But my money is strongly on Henry. That diary entry, it can't be overlooked, and this just seems too obvious to me, even though the case is technically unsolved. Susan, for more than 3 decades, tried to finally find any clue that could lead her to Amy, and she always tried her hardest to push the investigation forward. A Facebook page called Find Amy Billig was made too. It was the only way for Susan to keep hoping that Amy would someday return to her home. But very sadly, Susan wouldn't get to experience this, because on June 7th, 2005, Susan Billig passed away from a heart attack at the age of 80. Susan was a pivotal character in Amy's search. She was a mother who would look straight into the eyes of danger if it meant that she could get her daughter back. And unfortunately, she never found peace or closure until her very last breath. As for Amy's brother, Josh, who's a stonemason, he still spreads the word about Amy on the dedicated Facebook page in hopes that he can get closure about his sister and finally learn whether she's still out there or not, because that's what Amy's parents, especially Susan, wanted the most, to never give up searching for Amy. The Billig family was always so close to finding clues about Amy, but they would get thrown back to square one over and over. This case is particularly devastating because no one to this day knows what happened to Amy. We can only pray that Amy, wherever she is is in peace. And in the end, all we can do is hope. Life in prison. X number of years, no possibility of parole. These are the words you hear me say towards the end of every video. They're condemning words for vicious criminals and wrongdoers for a life behind bars. But what we don't realize is that these very numbers given by the jury at the time of sentencing are finite. Many of these callous killers do eventually walk free. It could be 10, 20, or 30 years from now, but many do make it out. In today's case, the perpetrator has already been out of jail for almost a year after ending an innocent person's life. 17-year-old Mackenzie Cowell was just 2 months away from turning 18. She was a high school student with dreams of working in the beauty industry. But she mysteriously vanished on February 9th of 2010, and her disappearance devastated the community of Wenatchee, Washington. What people didn't expect, though, was that the person behind her disappearance was someone she saw every single day. The terrifying and mind-boggling case of Mackenzie Cowell is going to leave you speechless and angry, because even though the case is solved, you have to wonder if justice was really served. Welcome to True Crime Stories. If you're new here, I post new true crime cases every single week. No drama, no robot narrations, just a story and a crime. So if you want to see some good old-fashioned true crime documentaries, hit that subscribe button. It's totally free and it'll keep you up to date with all of my future videos. Mackenzie Nicole Cowell was born on April 1st, 1992, to parents Reed and Wendy Cowell. Mackenzie lived in Orondo, Washington, and at the time of the case, she was a senior at Wenatchee High School. According to her parents, Mackenzie was a happy and vibrant girl. One thing about Mackenzie was that she loved to dance, and she was even part of the school dance team, Applettes, and she had joined a local dance studio in Wenatchee. In 2010, Mackenzie was busy in her studies and spent time with both of her divorced parents. Her dad, Reed, went on to start a relationship with a woman named Sandy Francis, and her mom, Wendy, got into a relationship with a man named Joey Fisher. Even though this monumental change in the family dynamic can impact any child, Mackenzie was just happy for her parents. Besides, she had her own life to plan. At 17 years old, most young kids struggle with what they want to do in life, what career they want to pursue, and everything else. But Mackenzie knew exactly what she wanted to do. She was an excellent student in school, but she decided to enroll in a cosmetology job training program at the Academy of Hair Design in downtown Wenatchee. Now, hair and makeup were something Mackenzie was passionate about with a capital P. She had dreams of becoming a beautician, and she even modeled at the academy. For Mackenzie, this training was a 2-for-1. She could get hands-on experience working as a cosmetologist while getting that extra credit for her transcript. It's safe to say that Mackenzie had a plan for her future, and she was set on making her dreams come true. Mackenzie was a driven young girl who had massive plans, and she wasn't shy about aiming for the top. Her goals and ambitious nature made her likable by nearly everyone. Mackenzie was born to stand out, and she loved putting herself out there and wasn't the type of person to turn down fun. And by all accounts, Mackenzie had a fulfilling, happy life, and she was on the road to achieving great things. But all of that changed on a fateful day in February of 2010, when Mackenzie left the Academy of Hair Design and didn't return. February in Washington is cold and breezy, with temperatures dropping to around 19 degrees. Well, February 19th of 2010 was a similar day in Washington for Mackenzie. The air had a chilly bite to it, and she was working at the academy. At 3 p.m., Mackenzie decided to go out for a bit, and even asked her friends at the academy if it was okay for her to step out, to which they agreed. CCTV footage caught a bundled-up Mackenzie walking to the parking lot. She got in her 1999 red Pontiac Grand Prix and pulled out moments later. Cell phone records showed that Mackenzie sent a text to her boyfriend, Joaquin, that said, "Hey, what's up?" But sadly, this was the last time Mackenzie would ever use her phone. From the looks of it, Mackenzie didn't look like she was in a hurry, and according to her friends, she'd be gone for only 15 minutes. But more than 15 minutes went by, and there was no sign of Mackenzie. At first, this didn't alarm Mackenzie's friends. They thought she was just running late after changing her plans. Another reason why Mackenzie's friends weren't quick to call the police that day was that on Wednesdays, Mackenzie would meet up with her dad, Reed, for dinner and watch movies all night. It'd been a father-daughter ritual for a long time, so naturally Mackenzie's friends thought that she must have lost track of time with her dad. But what they didn't know was that Mackenzie wasn't with her dad either. In fact, Reed kept waiting for Mackenzie to show up for their dinner, but she never came. At around 5 p.m., a worried Reed bombarded Mackenzie with multiple phone calls and texts, but she didn't answer. At around 8 p.m., which was Mackenzie's curfew, Reed was a mess, and he was extremely worried and scared for his daughter. Knowing Mackenzie as a reliable, responsible, and punctual girl who never missed a curfew and always answered her phone, no matter how busy she was, Reed knew that this wasn't normal behavior. Deciding not to wait any longer, Reed reported 17-year-old Mackenzie Cowell missing. Fortunately, the detectives jumped into action right away, as Reed voiced his concerns and worries to them that Mackenzie hadn't made it home. The investigators decided to look for Mackenzie everywhere. They checked in with her friends, her mom Wendy, and even her boyfriend Joachim, but Mackenzie had seemingly vanished into thin air with no evidence left behind. Her car was also nowhere to be found, and she hadn't returned to the academy either. All of the calls on Mackenzie's phone were going to voicemail, and with every passing minute, the Cowell family felt a deep pit of fear growing inside of them. They didn't want to believe it, but their minds couldn't help but wander to the possibility that something terrible had happened to Mackenzie, or that she was in danger. Well, things for the Cowell family only went south from this point, and it all started with a phone call. It wasn't from Mackenzie like they were hoping, though. It was from the police. The call from the police was about a bizarre discovery. See, a local resident had found an abandoned red car near his driveway. The area was near Mission Ridge, and it was about 40 miles away from Mackenzie's home in Orondo. The investigators soon took the car in, and the license plates were checked, and the car was registered under Reed's name. And when they looked at the model, they knew that it was Mackenzie's Pontiac Grand Prix. But there was no sign of Mackenzie, and finding her abandoned car was not looking good for the missing young girl. Inside the car, Mackenzie's handbag was found, but her phone, keys, and debit card were missing. By the car, there were a single set of footprints in the dirt. The detectives took in everything and decided to thoroughly inspect the car while a whirlwind of questions was going through everyone's mind. Why would Mackenzie frequent a remote area that wasn't familiar to her and abandon her car? And where were her belongings? The police, as well as the Cowell family, now knew for certain that something was terribly wrong, and Mackenzie's disappearance was no longer just a missing person case. With the discovery of Mackenzie's car, a full-blown search was held, including ground and air searches with the help of a helicopter to find any clues. The investigators even turned to the FBI for assistance in finding Mackenzie, and volunteers from the community looked far and wide for her. But 4 days after Mackenzie disappeared, another discovery was made. It was horrific, and it deepened the Cowell family's fear. On the banks of the Columbia River near Quincy, Washington, at a resort community about 20 miles away from Wenatchee, a woman's body was found. 50 yards away from the body was a vacant house, which was for sale at the time. The woman was fully clothed in the black academy uniform that was the same as the one Mackenzie wore on the day of her disappearance. Her feet were in the water, and at a distance, there was discarded duct tape and multiple trash bags. Soon after this discovery, tragically, the woman was identified as 17-year-old Mackenzie Cowell. Her body was taken in for an autopsy, and the results showed that Mackenzie had suffered blunt force trauma to the head. But her cause of death was strangulation and wounds to the neck. What's even more chilling was that the murder weapon, a long and sharp serrated knife, was found lodged in her shoulder. Thankfully, her autopsy revealed that there were no signs of assault. After the tragic discovery of Mackenzie's body, her family got to know about the horrible news of her passing. Mackenzie's parents were left grieving their daughter's tragic demise, and they couldn't believe that someone had done something so brutal to Mackenzie, a young, bright girl who had never hurt anyone. The Cowell family, at that point, knew that they needed closure, and the only way they were going to get justice for their daughter was by making the wrongdoer pay. The police assembled the Mackenzie Cowell Task Force, and it was tasked with finding potential suspects and persons of interest in Mackenzie's case. The investigators initially suspected none other than Mackenzie's boyfriend, Joachim, and he agreed to take a polygraph test, but failed. which raised suspicion in the minds of the police. They also suspected Mackenzie's stepfather, Joey, as the two had gotten into a pretty heated argument the day before she went missing. But the two men were both soon cleared by the police, and they both had airtight alibis, so the detectives were back to square one. The investigators interviewed almost 800 people and received multiple leads. The case of Mackenzie Cowell became the largest multi-agency investigation in the Wenatchee area since 1997. But the detectives soon received a bizarre lead, and it came from a woman named Liz Reed. Her recollection of events was believable, but she turned out to be an unreliable source since she was a drug addict, dealer, and a police informant, as well as a college student. Though I'm not sure how the college student thing really plays into this. But according to Liz, Mackenzie had been killed by two other drug dealers, Sam Cuevas and Emmanuel Serros, in a mistaken identity case. Liz even went as far as stating that she saw a snuff film and that the two men admitted to killing Mackenzie by saying, quote, "I choked her to shut her up." Now, the reason why investigators believed Liz's version of events was that she was able to describe the murder weapon before it was made public, so it wasn't something everyone knew. Moreover, Liz gave the police a ring that apparently belonged to Mackenzie, and they confirmed this by pulling up a past picture of her wearing this exact ring, even though Mackenzie's parents claimed they'd never seen it. When asked where she got the ring from, Liz claimed that she was instructed by Sam to go to a dump site to get it. But soon after this confession was made, Liz claimed she'd made the whole thing up, and detectives were able to confirm that neither she nor the two men that she had mentioned had any link to Mackenzie whatsoever, nor were any of these people at the scene of the crime on the day that Mackenzie lost her life. With a highly confusing case and leads that hit dead ends, the detectives were left baffled, but they still didn't stop looking. The evidence they had collected thus far had to give them a clue, so they combed through each and every one until they came across one particular letter, and the information in it would turn the case on its head. The most pivotal lead the investigators received from the public was a letter from a police informant named Theo Keys. According to Theo, his friend Christopher Wilson was behind Mackenzie's disappearance. So where were Theo and Christopher? And did the letter really have something to do with Mackenzie's passing? Well, as far as Theo was concerned, he had a history of mental illness and was currently serving jail time for inappropriate public behavior. So by the looks of it, the detectives were getting major deja vu from this tip. But they decided to look into it nonetheless, and they were glad they did, because there were a lot of coincidences in this tip, and specifically Christopher Wilson. Not much is known about Christopher Scott Wilson, but what we do know is that he was actually a fellow student at the Academy of Hair Design, the same school where Mackenzie was enrolled. He was a 29-year-old man with dyed black hair and a gothic aura about him. From the looks of it, he seemed to be a normal, quiet guy. But in Theo's letter, it was stated that Chris had an unhealthy fascination with death and serial killers. Chris also had an obsession with the crime drama series Dexter. Chris also idolized Hannibal Lecter from the movie The Silence of the Lambs, and he had a tattoo of him on his arm. Now, liking morbid things doesn't exactly make anyone a textbook murderer, but this next bit might leave you feeling uneasy. See, when the investigators looked into Chris's background, they found out that he frequented various online serial killer forums. Investigators also found out that Chris worked at Telford's Chapel of the Valley, a morgue in East Wenatchee. According to friends, Chris had claimed that he enjoyed, quote, cutting people up, which is just insane to hear. So on August 11th of 2010, Chris was called in for an interview, and initially he was very cooperative. He said that he didn't know Mackenzie as anyone other than a fellow student, although the letter from Theo stated that Chris apparently had a crush on Mackenzie, and that the two were in a budding relationship, but no one can confirm this bit of information, so take it as you will. Chris, during the interview, even agreed to give his DNA, and when it was tested with the DNA found on the duct tape at the scene, lo and behold, it was a match. All of these revelations were pinning Chris as the possible suspect in Mackenzie's untimely death. In October, Chris was brought in for another interview, and when asked about his DNA matching the DNA at the place where Mackenzie's body was found, he stopped cooperating and talking altogether and demanded a lawyer. On October 6th, Chris was arrested and charged with second-degree murder and held on $1 million bail. But DNA wasn't the only thing that caused Chris to be arrested. See, on the day that Mackenzie exited the academy, Another person followed out shortly after, and it was none other than Chris. Another report said that a man matching Chris's description was seen where Mackenzie's car was abandoned, and this couldn't have been a coincidence. If that wasn't enough, Chris's former home, which was a rented apartment located just 3 blocks away from the academy, was also searched by the police, and at first glance, nothing seemed out of the ordinary, until a luminol test was conducted. It glowed in one specific location that was covered in carpet. Even though the apartment was cleaned after Chris moved out, this evidence was a jackpot for the police. Under the carpet, there was a sizable patch of dried up blood, and when this blood was tested, it was a match to Mackenzie's. Moreover, cell phone data showed that Mackenzie's phone last pinged from the exact location of Chris's apartment between 3 and 3:42 p.m. on the day of her disappearance. In the midst of the investigation, someone came forward with their own experience with Chris before Mackenzie's disappearance and subsequent passing, and it was safe to say that it was anything but pleasant. A woman named Shauna Novak came forward and claimed that Chris had tried to strangle her at a party once to the point of unconsciousness, which is terrifying. When she demanded that he stop, Chris apologized and said that he didn't mean to harm her. I'd love to know how the situation actually played out because this whole scenario doesn't even add up to me. But anyway, Shauna was obviously left traumatized by this, and she was certain that Chris was trying to harm her. Had she not fought back, who knows what Chris would have done. Evidence was piling up against Chris at this point, and the investigators were certain that they had their man. But there was one other twist that revealed more about Chris and his involvement in Mackenzie's death. In December of 2011, the police made another arrest, and this person was Chris's ex-girlfriend, Tessa Shilman. She was charged with helping Chris hide any trace of the crime. See, the investigators went through Chris's computer, and they found numerous photos and videos of Tessa. They were disturbing because Tessa was posing as a corpse in the same place on the carpet where the bloodstain was found. The investigators also found a video on Tessa's phone, and it showed Chris walking around the apartment with Tessa on June 24th of 2010. When the camera panned to the carpet, a large reddish-brown stain was visible. Another video, recorded 4 days later, showed Chris walking around the apartment asking, quote, if it was clean. Tessa's answer to this was chilling, as she proceeded by saying, yes, considering what happened. It's vague, but knowing what we know now, it is a haunting statement. Phone records later showed that Chris and Tessa talked to each other at around 3:32 p.m. on February 9th, but that's not all. Tessa and Chris proceeded to call each other 5 more times that very evening, and Chris even borrowed Tessa's car even though he had a fully functioning car of his own. Also, Tessa's current boyfriend, who happened to live in the same area where Mackenzie's body was found near Columbia River, said she called him on February 9th at around 9 p.m. She asked him to pray for her, as, quote, something bad had happened. Tessa's car was searched for DNA, and even though a knife and cigarette butts were found inside, the DNA didn't match what was found at the crime scene. But investigators had a lot of evidence against Chris, and he was awaiting trial. Chris's charges were changed from second-degree murder to first-degree murder in April of 2011. Before the trial, Chris was offered a plea deal in which he would be charged with 6.5 years for pleading guilty to first-degree manslaughter. But shockingly, he rejected the deal. Chris's defense lawyer was none other than John Henry Brown, and if you're a true crime fiend, then you would know that John Henry Brown is one of the most popular criminal defense attorneys in Seattle. He's defended several infamous serial killers and high-profile defendants, including Ted Bundy, Colton Harris Moore, better known as the Barefoot Bandit, and many others. Chris's defense was built on the fact that the blood found in his former apartment was planted by the police. For some reason, the prosecution wasn't allowed to bring up Chris's work history in a funeral home, his eccentric obsession with Dexter, and even his alarming Hannibal Lecter tattoo. The prosecution, on the other hand, speculated that Chris had somehow lured Mackenzie into his apartment where he ended her life. Now, truthfully, we don't know whether Mackenzie willingly met with Chris or if she was lured. But at the end of the day, both individuals left the academy separately, and there were no messages of any form of communication between the two. After ending Mackenzie's life, the prosecution believed that Chris moved her body from his apartment to the Columbia River. He then abandoned her car near Mission Ridge. In the end, Chris was offered another plea deal, in which he would be sentenced to 14 years in prison for first-degree manslaughter of Mackenzie Cowell. While it may seem strange, this plea deal he accepted. Christopher Wilson was charged with first-degree manslaughter, first-degree robbery, and second-degree assault in an unrelated case and was sentenced to 14 years and 3 months in prison. All that time, Chris maintained his innocence, claiming that he only agreed to the plea deal because he believed that he wouldn't get a fair trial. I feel like a more accurate way to have said this is that as the trial rolled on, Chris began to realize just how much evidence the prosecution had against him, so he chickened out. As for Tessa, she didn't get punished, and she was free to go scot-free. It was concluded that there wasn't enough evidence to prove whether Tessa was involved in Mackenzie's passing or not. But it's weird knowing that she and Chris talked on the phone multiple times on February 9th, the cryptic yet creepy videos, and the call that she made to her boyfriend. Did Tessa barely dodge a bullet? Did she really have no idea about Chris ending Mackenzie's life? Sadly, we'll never know. There's a very real chance Chris had just made up some crazy story about the big stain in the floor, and Tessa believed the story and played along as a genuinely innocent joke. But we'll never truly know. Not long after his sentence, Chris filed a motion to withdraw his guilty plea, but it was rejected by the Washington Court of Appeals. He was incarcerated at Larch Correction Center, then later transferred to Monroe Correctional Center, and was eligible for parole in 2023. On December 11, 2023, Christopher Wilson was released from prison, having served his sentence. He's required to report to a community custody officer for the next 3 years, and he's placed on probation until December of 2026. Following Mackenzie's death, a memorial service was held on February 25, 2010 in Wenatchee. Almost 1,800 people were in attendance, and a tribute was paid to Mackenzie by her high school dance team before setting hundreds of purple and pink balloons into the sky. Tearful speeches and mentions of Mackenzie left everyone feeling vacant and agonized. Mackenzie's family goes through bouts of pain and suffering whenever they remember her cheerful and her genuine smile. Mackenzie had so much to look forward to in her life, and she would have made her mark on the world, but for now, the Cowell family was left to pick up the pieces after Mackenzie's departure, and they're still reeling from the haunting absence of such a vibrant soul in their lives. Ultimately, this case leaves you seesawing between fulfillment and dissatisfaction. Did Mackenzie really get justice? Well, yes and no. Yes, because the perpetrator was caught, but no, because 14 years is nowhere near enough, and the fact that he's a free man today makes everything about this case all the more grim and terrifying. It's scary to believe that despite DNA and multiple other damning pieces of evidence, Chris's family stood by him. There are a lot of people out there supporting Chris and slandering the justice system for convicting an innocent person. But here's the thing, if you really give him the benefit of the doubt, there is a genuinely small but genuine chance that Chris may have been innocent all along. For example, as far as we know, Chris had no known relationship with Mackenzie. We know that they went to the same school, but that's it. There were rumors that the two were beginning some sort of romance, but literally zero evidence for this ever popped up. We don't even have any evidence that the two had ever spoken a single word to each other in the past. Worse yet, many people believe Mackenzie's mother's boyfriend may have been behind her death, as the day before Mackenzie disappeared, she had a big fight with her mother and left the house after declaring to her mother she either pick her or her boyfriend, because she couldn't have both. While the boyfriend did have a supposedly solid alibi for the night of the attack, alibis have been proven false multiple times in the past, so you have to wonder. But the biggest piece of evidence of all actually belongs to Chris's claims that the police planted the blood in his apartment. There's a chance he might be telling the truth. See, the amount of injuries that Mackenzie sustained means that she would have lost an incredible amount of blood during the attack. But the amount found in his apartment, according to some reports, was very, very small. Is this evidence that it was planted? Or is this evidence that his apartment wasn't the original crime scene? Or is it evidence that he covered his apartment in plastic, but unknowingly left a small hole somewhere? We just really don't know. I'm certainly not defending Chris in all of this. I do think he did it. But you have to admit, there is a little bit of room for reasonable doubt. But if Chris really is behind the crime, and I believe he is, what's so frustrating is why? Why did Chris take Mackenzie's life? There's literally no motive. This case is just tragic. Even if the perpetrator did their time, you can't help but feel that the punishment Chris received for ending Mackenzie's life was nothing more than a slap on the wrist. What Mackenzie's family must be feeling, knowing that their daughter's killer is now free, is beyond comprehension. And we can only hope that they find peace and solace in the memories Mackenzie made with them in her very, very short 17 years of life. Thank you guys for tuning in to another episode of True Crime Stories. I wanted to give a special thank you to a couple channel members, including Abby Lopez and Carl2112. If you also want to become a member of the channel, you'll gain access to new videos sometimes days or weeks before they're uploaded to the public. And it's a great way to support the channel and help out. And I really appreciate all of you that have decided to do that. If you want to join, you can click that big join button below the video or find the link down in the description. And don't forget, True Crime Stories t-shirts are also now available. And you can grab one of those from the link down in the description as well. But as always, if you enjoyed this video, check out this other interesting case I covered. And don't forget to subscribe. It's totally free and just keeps you up to date with all my future videos. But my name is Ty Knotts, and I'll catch you guys in the next one.